right. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Deborah and I are very excited to share our research today on how we learn from instructor and self-generated drawings. And this is part of an interdisciplinary collaboration that combines my interests in student cognition and learning from visualizations with Deborah's interests and expertise in the neuroscience of motor control. And so together, our goal is to understand not just whether drawing supports learning, but how and why drawing supports learning. So I'm going to start today by discussing some of the opportunities and challenges associated with learning from visualizations, and talk about some of approaches to try to address those challenges, both through the types of design decisions that we make and how these decisions affect students' information processing, as well as through other approaches to foster productive cognitive engagement with visualizations, including asking students to create their own drawings. And then I'll shift to kind of a hybrid approach where students learn by observing the instructor actively generate drawings by hand. And this is where Deborah is going to take over, and she'll tell us about how we can use tools from neuroscience to try to understand the underlying cognitive and neural mechanisms of instructor drawing and what this might mean for illustrators and educators. So I don't think I have to convince this audience that visualizations are powerful tools, especially when trying to communicate complex content like how biological systems work. And visualizations are effective for learning because they can make the relationships among complex structures and processes explicit to learners, allowing them to internalize those relationships and build coherent mental models of how systems work. But we know that visualizations don't necessarily always lead to better understanding. There are lots of different ways that you can visualize the same content, and not all of those ways produce better learning outcomes. So from a learning perspective, we really have two main challenges we're trying to address. One challenge is managing cognitive load. So how do we manage the cognitive demands that we place on learners when learning from visualizations so that we're not overburdening them with unnecessary demands that detract from their learning? But the second challenge is that how do we foster productive forms of cognitive engagement so that students are actively making sense of the material rather than just passively viewing it. And so most of what I talk about today will touch on at least one of these two challenges. The first challenge is to manage students' cognitive load. Okay, so we can think of cognitive load or students as having a limited capacity to process new information at any given time. And of course, learning requires cognitive load to some extent. So we can distinguish between kind of good cognitive load and maybe bad cognitive load. So learning obviously requires cognitive effort to some degree just based off the inherent complexity of the material. And we can call that intrinsic load. So this is essential, right? So if you're learning about the circulatory system, there's just a certain amount of cognitive effort that's required to mentally represent the different structures and processes and coordinate those, right? But the problem is that learners often also face additional cognitive demands that are unnecessary and irrelevant to learning. And we'll call that extraneous load. So this is load that's created by just suboptimal design. So if a diagram is too cluttered, or the information is disorganized, or there's excessive details that are irrelevant and detracting students' attention, now students are using some of their very limited cognitive fuel towards things that are irrelevant to learning, and they're not able to focus on what the types of relationships that we want them to think about. So because cognitive capacity is so limited, it's very easy for us to have a situation of cognitive overload where the combination of the load that's just intrinsic to the material and the load that we're imposing on them through suboptimal design exceeds their capacity, and now they just don't simply have enough resources to accurately represent what they're learning. And so the goal is not to completely eliminate cognitive load, but to try to reduce the unnecessary demands that we're placing on learners so that they can focus on constructing meaning from what they're learning. So there are many ways to do this, and you're probably familiar with some of these. There's lots of research on multimedia principles of how to modify the design of visualizations to reduce extraneous load. I'll just give a couple of very simple examples just to illustrate this idea. One is called signaling. Again, this is probably very intuitive to you. You probably use this kind of technique a lot. But we can imagine maybe a standard visualization here of the circulatory system, maybe from a narrated animation where students are listening to an explanation and they're looking at the visual, and they have to kind of direct their attention to the relevant parts of the diagram as it's being explained. But we might make a very simple modification to this and just add signaling that highlights what we want them to be focusing on at specific times. So we just might highlight a particular part, like the valves of the heart, when that part is being talked about, and block out the rest. Right? So this is just directing students' attention to the relevant information so that they're not likely to engage in extraneous processing where they're kind of searching the diagram and therefore not necessarily thinking about what we want them to be thinking about during the lesson. So this is a very simple kind of change, but it actually has very measurable effects on how students process visuals and how they learn from them. Beyond just directing their attention to where we want them to look, we can also use design to help them make connections across different sources of information. So this is sometimes referred to as spatial contiguity. And so I'm going to show you some eye movements of students learning from two different versions of the exact same lesson on how a car's brake system works. So on the left, you can see that the text and the diagrams are spatially separated. So we're going to look at their eye movements. Hopefully this will work. Oh, it's doing the wrong one. We're going to do this one first. Look on the left there. So you can see when separated like that, the student has a choice. They can either kind of search around for the diagram to figure out where they should be looking, but a lot of times they'll just ignore the diagram. They'll have to read the whole text first, and they're like, okay, now where do I look? So there's a lot of jumping around. They go to the text, okay, let's just bouncing around. There's a lot of extraneous, like what am I supposed to be looking at? Maybe go back to the text. We would ideally see much more coordination of you look at that specific part of the text, you look at that specific part of the diagram. It's very difficult to do when those things are spatially separated. So you can kind of see extraneous load in action there. Now if we make a very simple design change, all we're doing is taking the exact same text and integrating it with that relevant part of the diagrams. We see a very different kind of pattern where now attention immediately goes to the first step of the text, then to the relevant part of the diagram. Then it goes to the next part of the text, and you see much longer fixations on the relevant parts of the diagram. Very little wasted attention here, right? So it's much more coordinated attention. You can see the difference between the two is basically a lot of jumping around, extraneous processing, and here much more focused on making those connections between specific elements of the text and specific parts of the diagram. So these are just a couple of many different approaches that have been supported by lots of research, that when you make these kinds of little changes to reduce extraneous load, it does tend to benefit learning. So we want to make those types of design decisions, but it's not always enough, right? Because making changes in how we present information does not guarantee that students will just spontaneously invest the cognitive resources that they have left over to make sense of it. So what we can think of is reducing extraneous load kind of creates the opportunity for learning. It's kind of clearing the space. Now there's space available that these resources that I now have can be devoted to learning, but it's very difficult to guarantee that just through how we present the information alone. Because learning ultimately depends on what students are actively thinking about during learning, and it's hard to cause that directly with just design alone. And what we're really trying to do is how can we foster some of the key cognitive processes that are underlying making sense of the information that's presented to students. So there are three key cognitive processes that we're trying to support. We want students to select the important information, so they have to figure out what's most important, organize that information into a coherent structure, kind of mental model, and then integrate that information with their existing knowledge. So in other words, we want them to generate an interpretation of the information, not just study it, right? So let me just give you a quick example of that. We can imagine just a kind of a standard lesson. You don't have to read all the text there, but just a little excerpt of text explaining the circulatory system and then a diagram. And so at this point, this is just information, right, on the screen, on the slide. It's up to the student to transform that information into actual usable knowledge. So you can imagine a student could approach this, even if it's very well designed and there's not any extraneous load, they can still approach this quite passively, right? So what we want is, ideally, is for students to be kind of having an internal explanation to themselves of what's going on. We want them to be thinking about the underlying structures and functions and principles that are being conveyed in the text and the visual. So we might want them, in this case, to be thinking, oh, okay, well, our heart's acting kind of as a double pump. We've got one side going to the lungs and the other side going to the body. And we want students to recognize those kinds of patterns and how that relates to their existing knowledge. But we know that when you just provide students with static materials like this, students may not do that spontaneously. So it suggests they need some explicit prompting to actually get them more cognitively engaged with the material. So one way to do that is to ask students to create their own drawings of what they're learning. So what we can do is, instead of giving students all the information up front, we can just give them text, like this excerpt here about the circulatory system, and ask them to take the text and create their own visual representation without seeing a provided visual first. That might look like something like this. And what happens during this kind of translation process is that students have really no choice but to engage in those kinds of key cognitive processes. They have to use the text, pick out what is the most important information, how can I organize this into some sort of coherent visual model. And by definition, the fact that they're having to translate from, into a new qualitatively different representation, from a verbal representation to a visual representation, it has to be integrated with their existing knowledge because they're creating a visual that wasn't there before, right? And so we've done lots of studies in the lab of students learning from various science texts. These are undergraduates. And students tend to benefit and learn better when we prompt them to create drawings from text than if we just have them study provided materials. So but there is still an important role for provided visuals. It's just that they can play a slightly different role when they're integrated with self-generated visuals. So we can have, for example, students generate a drawing, which may very well, especially with undergraduates who might not have a lot of background knowledge, may contain a lot of errors, right? They sometimes will struggle to generate high-quality drawings. But then we can use the provided visuals serving as a different function, more as feedback, and have students compare what they generated to the provided visual, right? So that they engage in this natural sort of comparison process, whereas originally, if we just show them the provided visual up front, their default is kind of to approach this very passively. But if we have them generate their own drawing first, now they're more prepared to naturally say, okay, I've generated this drawing. How does this compare to the provided representation? And they're more prepared to productively engage with the provided visual, right? So they can compare their drawing, notice potential misconceptions and errors, and then have an opportunity to revise their drawing based on what they're seeing in the provided visual. And we found in the lab that students this sequence does matter. So if we have students draw before they study a provided visual, that's more effective than if we show them a provided visual first and then have them draw. Because when they see the provided visual first, they tend to study it pretty passively and then try to copy it. But if we have them draw first, they're kind of forced to generate their own interpretation first, and then they can compare it to the accurate representation and revise their knowledge. Okay. So drawing can be effective, right? There's lots of research suggesting that generally under the right conditions, drawing is an effective learning strategy in various areas of science. But it can still be a little bit tricky to implement. One is it's kind of time consuming and it is quite effortful and difficult for students. And sometimes that effort is not always directed to essential kind of forms of processing of the learning material. Sometimes they're thinking about the appearance of their drawings, or they're preoccupied with specific details that might not be relevant to the kind of underlying conceptual information we want them to focus on, or they're just kind of concerned about just the mechanics of drawing. And so that might not be ideal sometimes. So often students need a lot of additional scaffolding and feedback to make sure that they're actually generating high quality drawings. And there's also a little bit of a motivational barrier with students in drawing, especially undergraduates who might not have had a lot of experience using drawing as a strategy yet. And we found that a lot of students do report having kind of low confidence in drawing, maybe not perceiving drawing as being an effective strategy. And so that can be a bit of a problem when trying to implement this. And so what we've done recently is tried to think, okay, well, how can we come up with a sort of a hybrid approach that gets us the benefits of drawing without some of the costs of implementation? And that's where we've started to do some more research on kind of this alternative approach where we show students an instructor dynamically create drawings by hand during a lesson. So on the left, you have the completed, a static drawing of the heart, and this is in a video, so they would be listening to an explanation. And on the right, you have the instructor's hand creating the exact same diagram, and you're listening to the exact same explanation, but it's being kind of unfolding over time. And obviously, these are quite popular style of videos and kind of intuitively engaging and appealing, and maybe you've used some of these. But surprisingly, there's not really a lot of great research that's actually testing how these types of lessons affect students' learning. We do have some preliminary evidence from the lab that suggests that there are benefits, that students do often learn better when they see an instructor create drawings by hand, the exact same drawings, same explanations, when you compare it to just showing the same drawing that's just already completed. And so the question that's been motivating our research and our collaboration has been, why do we see this benefit of observing the instructor draw? You could probably think of some possible explanations. One is just drawing kind of, as you can see in the video, just sort of inherently follows some of those basic multimedia principles that I mentioned earlier. I mean, one, it can direct attention to the relevant information, kind of naturally breaks down the information into smaller parts, and the drawing is coordinated with the presentation of the corresponding explanation. So it could just be, one explanation is that it's just inherently following these kind of multimedia principles. But it's also possible that there's something unique about observing drawing, something unique about learning from observing the actions of others. And so we wanted to kind of tease out, is there something beyond just multimedia principles explaining this effect? So to really fully answer this question, we need to go beyond just kind of the conventional lab studies and behavioral methods and use some more advanced kind of tools to try to get at the underlying mechanisms of the cognitive and neural mechanisms of instructor drawing. And for that, I'm going to pass it on to Deborah, who's going to tell you about how we can use tools from neuroscience to understand these mechanisms. Okay. This?
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry.
All right, thanks. So, like Logan said, what we want to do is more fully understand why observing an instructor draw might support learning. And so to do that, we need to really ask how students are processing that content in real time. And I'm a neuroscientist, and so when I think about these questions, I think about the brain. And luckily, we have decades of neuroscience research that gives us a really strong framework to think about what might be happening under the hood when students watch the instructor draw. So you're probably aware, but the brain is composed of different regions that are well-defined based on anatomical landmarks with some individual variability, of course. Example, right, 2 hemispheres, left and right, 4 lobes of the brain within each hemisphere. And early research has really focused on the defining separate functions of the individual regions of the brain and which brain regions might be active for different types of tasks. But more recent research has really defined that the brain is organized rather than distinct individual regions as a set of large-scale interconnected regions and networks that are in sync with each other, right? And so each of these networks can support distinct aspects of perception, cognition, action. So for example, attention, motor planning, understanding of others. Just an example, one of the common networks we talk about is called the default mode network, here in red, which combines some of these integrated regions. And the default mode network, as the name implies, are regions that are typically active when you're not doing anything in particular at all. So we can measure it actually by just having you be at rest in an MRI. But it's really an important region researchers have found for self-reflection, internal processing, perspective planning, and things like that. So we can use these examples instead of asking how drawing or observing drawing activates the brain in general, a more useful question can be, how does it engage these different networks, and how might that actually support student learning and understanding? So one network that I want to talk about here that's particularly relevant is called the dorsal intention network. And as the name implies, it's critically important for orienting attention towards things that are goal relevant from a top-down way, as also things that are visually salient, right? So what this network is really thought to do is help us select what matters in more cluttered environments, right? And so neuroscientists have studied this a lot with simple attentional cueing tasks, right? So in this example, a color cue will tell the participant to, with a strong likelihood that the target's going to appear on the left in this case, and so during this delay period, the subject will focus their attention on the left side of space, and behaviorally you can show that this cueing helps participants respond faster to when the target appears. They press a button to correspond with left or right. And what you can do is you measure brain activity during this variable delay period, so when they've been cued and are directing their attention, and you get this very consistent network of regions that include both visual processing regions as well as frontal and parietal regions that are supporting top-down goal-directed behavior. And so these are working together to really direct our attention. So from this perspective, it makes sense that, as Logan talks about, drawing naturally guides students' attention to the most important elements of the visual, and so is really leveraging this dorsal attention network and can help manage cognitive load more effectively. So a second but related network that we think is highly relevant is called the action observation network. And again, as the name implies, the defining feature of this network is that it is engaged when we are observing the actions of others, right? So for example, we can ask participants to watch someone tie knots or do other simple motor tasks, and we see very consistent activation of certain sensory and motor regions. And the key thing is that when you watch someone tie a knot, what gets activated is very similar to if we ask you to actually make the knot yourself. So, so the idea that what you're doing when you're observing is very similar to of actually executing the action, performing the action. So some of you might have heard the term like mirror neurons or the mirror system, and that gets over-exaggerated a lot and overhyped in media, but we can use this general concept to help us to think about how this network can help us predict the actions of others. And it really has important applications for how we learn, right? So for simple action-based tasks like learning how to tie a knot, researchers have shown that the level of activation in this network is related to subsequent performance. So someone who watches this knot tying ends up doing better than if you didn't observe the actions of others, even if you have the same amount of physical practice, right? So, obviously this doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden going to become Simone Biles by watching the Olympics, but it does seem to be tapping into some unique propensity to learn from the dynamic actions of others. So when students, in this perspective, when students watch an instructor draw, rather than just passively looking, they may be really mentally simulating or motor simulation of the drawing process, which really helps ground these abstract concepts and learning into bodily action through these network interactions. So we can put these ideas together and give kind of like a brain network-inspired hypothesis for why observing drawing may support learning, right? So first, observing drawing may help direct attention and manage cognitive load, and that would be via the dorsal attention network. And second, it may help learners mentally simulate abstract content by coupling it with some meaningful action. That would be from the action observation network. And so we can think about these overlapping networks, and these are obviously complementary processes, right? So attention can help determine really what information gets processed, whereas action simulation and observation may help determine how deeply this information is understood. And it's really giving us a mechanistic framework for thinking about how instructor-generated drawing can be a useful way to engage these core brain systems that support learning. And so this is kind of the framework that's been guiding Logan and my research into trying to understand the mechanisms of student learning. And so, the next logical question is, once we have this idea, how do we test these hypotheses, right? And so, again, we can borrow tools from neuroscience and cognitive science to help us out. So I'm just going to go through a couple examples of things that we've done or plan to do in lab to test these ideas. The first is eye tracking, right? So eye movements give us a window into lots of different cognitive processes. One thing that's useful, as Logan showed in the video earlier, is it helps us understand how learners are directing their attention and what different attentional strategies they're using to observe instructional materials. So when we compare eye movements to some static image versus instructor-generated dynamic drawings, we can see where they're looking, where the attention shifts, how tightly it's coupled to what's evolving in the drawing. So here's just an example video from a preliminary study that we did, testing learning from static and instructor-generated visuals. So here's an example of a student listening to a narration, but just having the static visual to support, and you can see their eyes are darting around all over the place, not really focused on any one thing for any long period of time. And we can compare that to a student that watched the drawing version of the task, and you can clearly see that they're focus their attention directly on the tip of the pen in this case, and that helps them basically follow the path of the drawing. And so we can quantify this pattern of eye movements, so thinking about fixations, sequence of eye movements, and as well as broader metrics like pupil size that can be a marker of attention. And so we can really test how observing drawing actually leads to more organized, goal-directed attention. Another approach that we have thought about focuses on drawing kinematics. So we can think about this from a motor control and action perspective, and really measure the spatial and temporal properties of the drawing itself. So again, here's an example from the same study, in which they're either watching a static or instructor-generated drawing. And then after they watch the video, we ask the student, as part of their post-test, to basically draw what they learned about. And we can see from this example, students may produce certain features of the instructor drawing and certain dynamics of the instructor drawing, even though they can't see that video itself or reference back to it. And again, we can see this qualitatively, but we can also quantify different metrics. So basically, we can look at the time they spend on the tablet versus off, the smoothness of the movement itself, or the specific sequence of the drawings to infer how students may be representing and mentally simulating the instructor's actions to help them learn, right? And that would be consistent with how we're engaging our action observation system, where our movements match that of what we observe. So those are two more behavioral approaches, and I think you can learn a lot about the brain from studying behavior alone. And so those are quite useful. But I want to close with two different approaches where we can look at brain dynamics and neural processes more directly. And so the first is fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and this allows us to map the time course of how different brain networks are involved. So we can put subjects into an MRI machine, we have them laying down, and just have them watch a drawing lesson, just as before. they could watch a static drawing with a narration or see the dynamic instructor-generated version. And so what we can do is, for any given region, we can track the fMRI response over time. This is called the bold signal or fMRI response pattern. That's basically tracking the summed response in that region as they're watching the video, a mix of noise and stimulus-related activation. Then what we can do is compare activity in this region in one person to activity in all the other regions, so thinking about different networks across all the other average of other participants, and then do some fancy analyses to extract the specific way that these networks are involved. And so we can really ask the question, not just what is activated when you're watching drawing, but test hypotheses about how these networks are engaged with each other while we observe drawing. And we predict that when students watch this more dynamic version, it may not only engage these attention networks and these action observation networks more strongly and more in tune with each other, but could actually, that extent of activation and connectivity could predict how well they're actually learning from these videos. And so finally, we can use this technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, and this can probe the state of the motor system more directly. And I don't know if anyone has experience seeing TMS as a technique. It's used a lot in clinical and rehabilitation situations, but this is what it looks like in the lab. So you can see, we'll hear a click. And so every time you hear that sound, it's a very brief electrical current that's inducing this magnetic field, and then it can activate the neurons in the underlying tissue. And so depending on where you place the coil on the head, here we're placing it over the part of primary motor cortex that controls our contralateral index finger and index muscle. So it basically can activate that entire pathway from brain to muscle to give, as you saw, a visible muscle contraction. And so what we can do here, and this is just a detailed representation of what's being activated, but the key idea is that TMS is, when we apply a single pulse, it's reflecting the summed activation of neurons from multiple sources, so directly underneath the tissue, but also all these network connections from areas that we might classically think of as involved in the action observation network. And so we can then measure that output by looking at the motor evoked potential, or the muscle activity that results from that from the TMS response. And what this does is we can measure that amplitude, and the higher the amplitude, it's reflective of essentially greater excitability. And so we can map that at different time points and really serve as a readout of the state of the motor system and how our action system is prepared at any given time. So what we can do is apply TMS at different points. Again, when a participant is watching a static video or watching an instructor-generated video, and test whether and when the action observation network is engaged during learning from drawing. So this is a complementary approach, of course, with fMRI and our behavioral methods, but we can really test more timing-specific hypotheses about the motor system and the involvement of these different networks during learning. So to conclude, we'd just like to give a few key takeaways and offer some small suggestions for how we might think about designing illustrations to support student learning. So first, we can think about visualizations support learning most when they reduce unnecessary demands and reduce our cognitive load, right? And we can think about how to apply this by designing to highlight those key elements, whether through multimedia principles of of signaling and how we're organizing the drawing, but really thinking about how we're highlighting the structure rather than focus on just increasing the realism or aesthetics. Right? And then we can think about effective visualizations should really foster meaningful engagement with the material. So how do we not just present information, but actually support these active and ongoing cognitive processes? And as Logan showed in his research, one way to do this is to pair learning from professional or instructor-generated visuals with those that students generate themselves, and then it can be an iterative comparison and revision process to really support that learning. And then finally, we can think about, from a neuroscience perspective or cognitive science perspective, of understanding why drawing is effective, and that has implications not just for instruction, but also for how we're communicating this information to our students and how we're communicating it to the broader science community. And even though we're just getting in this initial stages of this type of work, we can already, we can use our knowledge about how these brain networks are organized to guide our illustration process. And I think the key here is thinking about leveraging the process of creating visuals. So having the students watch in real time as they're creating it and thinking about the dynamics of your drawing and have that map on to these physiological processes, because oftentimes, these things are dynamic, and so if we can track that in the drawing itself, it can be just as helpful for student learning, or more helpful than relying on the final image. Right? And so finally, I just want to close that this work, we can really think about interdisciplinary collaboration as important for advancing this our understanding, right? So not just between education and neuroscience, but also in the way that we're using illustrations and thinking about visual design. And so we're really excited about this because thinking about how people really learn from observing visualizations and how the brain supports that process can create a lot of different opportunities for how we think about improving teaching and learning across different contexts. So with that, I'd like to thank our collaborators. So Anne was the illustrator for all of the drawings that you saw for our preliminary studies. So that's been great to work with and really improve the design aspects of our visualizations. Andrea Wilkie and Sienna Castro in Logan's lab have helped with some of our initial studies, and then the students in my brain action lab have helped with designing some of the initial neuroscience methods. And then I'd like to thank our funding from NSF and also the UGA College of Education. And thank you for your attention. Yeah, if you want to come back up, and then we have time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Logan and Deborah. Just like last time, I'm going to go around to anyone who has questions in the audience. And for our speakers, so our online audience can hear the answers and questions, if you could restate the question before you answer it, that'd be great.
Okay.
All right. And I'm looking at the online chat too. So if anyone watching has questions, just say the word.
Hi. So you had said that you see this like brain activity when someone is following a drawing, and part of this is kind of thinking about research that my professor Amanda Bear is using. So if she wants to say anything, but do you guys see any difference in style or difference in brain activity versus different illustration styles? So versus, does the brain react differently when they see line work, when they see something that's fully rendered, when they see something that's 3D, or is that kind of something that you haven't looked into?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and this is part of our what we're thinking about doing and kind of isolating the features of the drawing that are important. We're thinking about it more from, you see some videos, online instructional videos with the hand, and others you see just with the cursor. And so there's some evidence that just seeing someone's hand will activate similar and engage similar regions as if you're, moving your own hand, right? So, so we can think about it from these basic questions of design elements that you wouldn't really think are important or like that really matter, but they might actually be engaging your brain networks in a different way. So we're definitely looking at that, and then it makes sense to think about the more 3D renderings and how that might further support, or thinking about the important detail versus potentially extraneous detail and how that all kind of balances out. I don't know if you want to add to.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point, we're pretty at the preliminary stages, so we're basically using some of the types of diagrams that you saw, but we're definitely interested in looking at different types of designs, and I think one thing we were focused on is, how kind of determining what are the optimal conditions for instructor drawing, like, does the instructor have to draw everything? Is it just, can we have like a template and draw specific parts? Like, we're trying to get at kind of the dosage is kind of one of our research questions, but we haven't quite gotten to, different kind of stylistic features of drawings, but that's certainly something that we could look at in the future.
Cool, thank you. I'm super excited to see what you guys do. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm actually in a position where I'm trying to teach anatomy to a group of undergraduate students, and I use some of these ideas, but then I hit a roadblock with students who are not necessarily visual learners. Do you have any plans, or maybe have you looked at how to make this work for students who have different learning styles, like auditory, kinetic?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we forgot to restate the first question. Okay, so for the online audience. So that question was about perhaps individual differences in learning styles, possibly, and whether it might differ, the effects might differ across different learners. So I'll try to think of the best way to approach this. So generally, the evidence that there are different learning styles per se is not super strong. There certainly, learners have different preferences for different types of content and different ways of presenting information, but there's not actually solid evidence that adapting and saying, oh, these are visual learners and these are auditory learners, so they should get instruction that way, that they would learn better. That's actually not the case. It really depends more on the nature of the content, which would dictate what kinds of representations you should use. So so for certain content, it just lends itself to certain types of visualizations or other representations that are generally going to be supporting the same types of learning processes for most students. That's not to say that there aren't individual differences. There absolutely are, but it'd be more things like prior knowledge of the content is a super important individual difference. So if you have less prior knowledge, it's going to be more challenging to create drawings from a text like I showed. Or we've also looked at things like spatial ability, general spatial ability, which people do differ on. And so that's kind of related to kind of a style idea, but it's more about some people do just have a stronger ability to mentally visualize shapes and represent them in different ways. And it seems that those students tend to have an easier time creating complex drawings than other students. So it just might be that some students who might struggle with drawing just need more scaffolding, more support. So one way to scaffold drawing is, instead of just asking students to just create a drawing from scratch, we might give them kind of a template or like a partially provided illustration. They fill in some of the key parts rather than just expecting them to do everything, right? And so just, again, to kind of reduce some of the cognitive burden. So there's ways to make drawing, I think, more accessible to the students by providing additional supports like scaffolding and feedback, as well as just getting them more experience with drawing, because it's something, again, that some students just haven't really done, haven't used as a strategy, haven't been taught how to do this effectively. And so with that, I think it can make drawing a little bit more accessible to more students.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Hi, yeah, so I think you said there wasn't a lot of evidence on the instructor-led drawing, but I was just curious about iterations of that, like instead of having a hand draw something, having things appear, or having a full drawing already there, but you're signaling your way through it with circles or something, because then there's something to lead the eye.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that is some part of our collaboration is to do some more carefully designed behavioral studies in the lab where we actually can isolate, is it really drawing per se, or is it signaling, is it segmenting the material out? And so we're in the process of developing versions of the same video with just each of those things tweaked a little bit so that we can really say, well, because if we just, like you're suggesting, if we just compare drawing to completely static, there's lots of differences that could just be explained by simple attention, signaling types of things like that. But if we can create versions that, okay, everything is the same, except that we just took out the human movement element of it, and it's, but things are just kind of appearing on the screen in the same sequence. Is there something unique about seeing action specifically, or seeing the hand specifically versus a cursor, or other types of things like that? But so that's part of our research program, is to try to do very carefully designed experiments where we can really isolate that. Because at this point, the evidence for instructor drawing is based off mostly more of these kind of broader comparisons where it's not exactly clear what's actually explaining the effect. It just seems like intuitively that the drawing, there's something unique about drawing, but we don't know that for sure, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. Yeah.
And I think also that I didn't get into this much, but this is where neuroscience can help disentangle these hypotheses as well, beyond, just like we want to learn about the brain, and I think the brain is cool, so we should do it. But you can actually do things that maybe behavior alone might not be able to address. So in this case, we could say, this idea of, is a dynamic drawing where you might activate the motor system, and you might see a greater activation in that condition versus a guided, signaled version of it. But if it actually doesn't correlate with learning, then it could just be more epiphenomenal activation that doesn't necessarily matter from a design and a structural standpoint.
I'm interested in the idea of revision and the iteration on the student's behalf. You had showed that for the student drawing part that they would draw from the prompt and then check it against the standard model to sort of compare their information and sort of see what they would need to fix.
Right.
Have you looked at the next step of that, of having the student then redraw it or fix the things that they realized were wrong through drawing it? Yeah. And could there be an equivalent to that from the instructor side of things?
Yeah, so good question. So yeah, we have kind of studies either in my lab or other researchers have kind of broken down each of those kind of stages, like the generation phase of drawing, kind of the comparison phase of drawing, but also the revision phase. And it does seem that, and this is the big caveat, with appropriate guidance, that each stage does kind of offer a little bit more benefit. Right, but the challenge with it is that students do kind of struggle, especially when we're dealing with kind of undergraduates who are relative novices of this content. They do kind of struggle with each of those stages. So they might struggle with generating accurate drawings at the just initial stage, and then they need explicit guidance at that stage. But then when we ask them to compare to their provided visuals, sometimes that's effective, but actually sometimes they see it and they're like, wow, mine's completely different, they don't even know where to start, right? So they need support at that point to make the appropriate comparisons, right? And then when we ask them to revise it, sometimes they don't always focus on the types of changes and the kind of the conceptual elements of the material. They might get fixated on some of the other extraneous details about the drawing. So, that's where just scaffolding at each stage is necessary so that we're kind of making sure that they're not getting kind of distracted by thinking about the aspects of the drawing, either their drawing or the instructor provided drawing that aren't actually relevant. So that just has to do with can we scaffold it so that they're not likely to go off track during drawing? Can we scaffold it and we're prompting them so that they're making specific comparisons that we want them to make? And then at the revision stage, are we using instructor-provided visuals that are more targeted and help highlight the things that we really want to see in students' drawings? Because in this context, we're trying to get them to understand kind of the overall conceptual relationships, not necessarily like very specific, realistic details and all of that. And so that has implications for how you would design the visuals, right? If it was more advanced and you wanted the students to know, very specific details and they needed to actually understand the more detailed, the spatial layout of all the system, then you would want that to see that in their drawings. So sometimes students at the novice level get bogged down by some of the details if we don't really explicitly target those in how we prompt them and how we give them feedback.
All right, are there any other questions from the audience here? All right, thank you so much, Logan and Deborah. Your talk is wonderful.